Elvis's chef kept a secret for 40 years. When he finally talked, nobody was ready. He stood in that kitchen every single night for years. Grease on his apron, sweat on his forehead, cooking whatever Elvis wanted, whenever Elvis wanted it. 2 in the morning, didn't matter. 4:30 before sunrise, no problem, he never complained, he never talked, he just cooked. But decades after the king of rock and roll was found dead on a bathroom floor, this man, the person who prepared Elvis Presley's very last meal, sat down and finally opened his mouth. Not about recipes, not about famous guests, about what really happened inside Graceland during those final hours. And what he described doesn't line up with the story you've heard 100 times. This isn't tabloid gossip. This isn't some distant cousin trying to sell a book. This is a first-hand account from a man who was standing in the kitchen when history's clock was ticking down. A man who saw things that night that haunted him for the rest of his life. And when he finally decided to share them, his words changed the way people understood Elvis Presley's last moments on Earth. Before we get into what he said, if you're someone who appreciates real stories told by real people, not clickbait, not rumors, but genuine human accounts, go ahead and hit subscribe. We dig into stories like this every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's go back to where it all started. Most people can name Elvis's manager. They know about Colonel Tom Parker. They can probably name Priscilla, Lisa Marie, maybe even a few of the Memphis Mafia guys who followed Elvis around like a shadow. But almost nobody knows the names of the people who kept Graceland running day to day, the ones who mopped the floors, washed the sheets, and stood over hot stoves in the middle of the night cooking food for a man the whole world worshipped. Sam Thompson, Alvina Roy, Mary Jenkins, Pauline Nicholson, these were the invisible backbone of Elvis's world. They didn't get autographs, they got paychecks, and most of them stayed quiet their entire lives. But among them, there was one man whose role was more intimate than people realize. He wasn't just staff. He was the person responsible for nourishing Elvis, literally feeding the king, night after night, year after year. And in that role, he saw a version of Elvis that no concert audience, no journalist, and no biographer ever witnessed. The Graceland kitchen wasn't some gleaming professional setup. It was a home kitchen, warm and worn, and it operated on Elvis's schedule, which meant it operated on no schedule at all. Elvis might wake up at 10 at night and want a full Southern spread, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, biscuits, the works. Or he might shuffle downstairs at 3 in the morning and only want a glass of buttermilk and a banana sandwich. You never knew. And whoever was in that kitchen had to be ready for anything. This chef, and there were several over the years, but the one whose testimony shook things up had been there during the critical final stretch, didn't just learn to cook what Elvis liked. He learned to read the man. He could tell by the sound of Elvis's footsteps on the stairs whether it was going to be a good night or a bad one. Heavy steps meant trouble. Light steps meant laughter. Silence meant stay out of the way. He learned that Elvis liked his bacon crispy but not burned, that he wanted his peanut butter warmed slightly before it went on the bread, that he preferred his eggs scrambled soft, almost creamy, with a little bit of cheese melted through. These weren't just preferences, they were rituals, and this chef honored every single one. But food was only part of it. In the kitchen late at night, with the rest of the world asleep and the mansion eerily still, Elvis would sometimes talk. Not perform, not entertain, just talk. He'd lean against the counter, sometimes still in his racquetball clothes, and say things he'd never say in front of the guys or the girlfriends or the hangers-on. And this chef listened. He always listened. If walls could talk, the Graceland kitchen would write a novel, and not the kind you'd expect. People imagine Elvis's life as this non-stop party, flashy jumpsuits, screaming fans, Cadillacs lined up in the driveway. And sure, some of that was real. But the kitchen told a different story. It told the story of a man who was often alone even when he was surrounded by people. The chef noticed things over the years that troubled him. Not at first. In the early days, Elvis was vibrant, funny, generous to a fault. He'd come into the kitchen and crack jokes, do impressions, tease the staff. He'd hand out $100 bills to people just because he felt like it. He'd ask about your family, remember your kid's birthday, offer to pay for your car repairs. That was the Elvis most people inside Graceland loved. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. The chef couldn't pinpoint exactly when. It wasn't a single moment. It was a slow erosion, like watching a riverbank wear away inch by inch. Elvis started eating differently. Some weeks, he'd eat everything in sight, enormous portions, multiple meals back to back, as if food was the only thing filling a void nothing else could reach. Other weeks, he'd barely touch anything. He'd ask for a plate, stare at it, push it away, and say he wasn't hungry after all. The pills were another thing. The chef wasn't a doctor. He didn't know what half of them were, but he saw the bottles. He saw how many there were lined up on the counter, tucked into pockets, sitting on nightstands throughout the house. And he noticed that the people around Elvis, the doctors, the aides, the inner circle, never seemed alarmed by it. If anything, they facilitated it. That bothered him. Not enough to say something at the time. Who was he to challenge Elvis Presley's personal physicians? But enough to file it away in a corner of his mind where it stayed, growing heavier with every passing year. There were nights when Elvis would come downstairs looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes glassy, his movements slow, his speech slightly off. The chef would make him something light, maybe some soup, maybe just toast, and sit nearby in case he was needed. Sometimes Elvis would eat in silence. Sometimes he'd start talking about his mother, Gladys, who had died years earlier. When he talked about her, his whole demeanor changed. The bravado dropped. The charm switched off. He became a boy again, missing his mama, wondering if she'd be proud of him, wondering if all of this, the fame, the money, the mansion, was what she would have wanted for him. Those moments were private, sacred almost, and the chef kept them locked away for decades. August 15th, 1977. It started like any other evening at Graceland. Elvis had been playing racquetball that night with his cousin Billy Smith and a few others. He was sweating, laughing, moving around with more energy than anyone had seen from him in weeks. It felt good. The staff noticed. There was a lightness to him that had been missing. The chef was in the kitchen preparing for whatever Elvis might want when he came in from the court. He had ingredients ready for a few different options. He'd learned long ago not to guess. Just be prepared. When Elvis walked through the back door, he was breathing hard but smiling. He looked tired in the body but alert in the eyes. That's how the chef described it later. There was still something there, something awake. Elvis asked for something to eat. Nothing crazy, nothing elaborate. The chef made him a simple meal, and here's where details get important, because what Elvis ate that last night has been debated and discussed and picked apart for decades. Some accounts say it was ice cream and cookies. Others say it was a heavier meal. The chef himself described it differently than the official story, and that discrepancy is part of what makes his testimony so significant. According to him, Elvis didn't eat much at all. He picked at a plate. He drank some water. He seemed preoccupied, not in a dark way, but in a thoughtful way, like his mind was somewhere else. The chef remembered Elvis standing by the counter and saying something that didn't register as important at the time, but would echo in his memory for the rest of his life. "I'm gonna get it together. I just need some time." That was it, no dramatic monologue, no tearful confession. Just a quiet statement said to a man holding a spatula at 2 in the morning, and then Elvis went upstairs. The chef cleaned the kitchen. He put the dishes away. He wiped down the counters, and he went home. The next time he heard about Elvis, it was on the news. After Elvis died, everyone wanted to talk. Former friends sold stories to magazines. Bodyguards wrote tell-all books. Ex-girlfriends appeared on talk shows. The entire Presley mythology got picked apart, repackaged, and sold in every conceivable format. But the chef said nothing. Not because he didn't care, because he cared too much. He felt that what he'd witnessed inside that kitchen, those private moments, those quiet conversations, those vulnerable glimpses of a man the world thought it knew, weren't his to sell. They were entrusted to him by proximity and by silence, and he intended to honor that. For years, friends and family would ask him what Elvis was really like. He'd give the same short answers. Good man, generous, funny. And then he'd change the subject. But as the decades passed, something started to eat at him. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was more like a sense of responsibility. He watched documentaries about Elvis that painted him as a reckless, drug-addled figure spiraling out of control. He read articles that reduced the man to a punchline, the fat Elvis jokes, the fried peanut butter sandwich memes, the caricature of excess and self-destruction. And he knew that wasn't the whole picture. Was Elvis struggling? Absolutely. Was he over-medicated? Without question. But was he the helpless, hopeless figure that pop culture had turned him into? The chef didn't think so. And the older he got, the more urgently he felt the need to say so. In his later years, he began to open up. Slowly at first. A comment here, a memory there. He told a friend that Elvis had been reading books about health and spirituality in those final weeks, that he'd talked about wanting to lose weight, wanting to get off some of the medications, wanting to find a way back to the person he used to be. He wasn't giving up, the chef said. Everybody thinks he was giving up, but I was there. I saw his face that last night. That wasn't a man who was done. That was a man who was making plans. It happened quietly. No cameras, no journalists. Just a small gathering of people, some of them Elvis fans, some of them historians, some of them simply friends who had been asking for years. The chef sat down and talked, really talked, for the first time in over 4 decades. He described the kitchen in detail, the layout, the smells, the sounds of the house at night. He described Elvis's mood that final evening, not with nostalgia, but with precision. He talked about the food. He talked about the water. He talked about the look in Elvis's eyes. And then he said the thing that made everyone in the room go still. They said he died because he couldn't stop, because he was out of control. But I'm telling you, he was trying to stop. He was trying to change. He told me so himself, and nobody ever talks about that part. He went further. He described a conversation from a few days before Elvis's death in which Elvis had asked him, casually, as if it were the most normal question in the world, whether he thought a person could just walk away from everything and start fresh. I told him sure, people do it all the time, the chef recalled. And he looked at me real serious and said, but can someone like me do it? Can someone who's been Elvis Presley their whole life just stop? The chef didn't have an answer for that. Not then, not now. But the question itself haunted him because it suggested that Elvis wasn't just passively declining. He was actively wrestling with his life, his identity, his future. He was asking the kind of questions that people ask when they still believe tomorrow is possible. That's what breaks my heart, the chef said. Not that he died, people die, but that he died right when he was starting to fight back. Right when he was thinking about getting better. That's the part nobody knows, and it changes the whole story. When the chef's words started circulating, through fan communities, online forums, small Elvis publications, the reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. For many longtime fans, this testimony offered something they had been searching for without knowing it: permission to see Elvis differently. Not as a tragic cautionary tale, but as a human being who was still reaching for something better even as the walls were closing in. One fan wrote online, "I've spent 30 years feeling sad about Elvis. This is the first time I've felt something closer to hope." Others pushed back. Skeptics questioned why the chef had waited so long. They wondered if time had softened his memories, turned ordinary moments into something more meaningful than they actually were. And that's a fair question. Memory is imperfect. Grief reshapes the past. But even the doubters had to contend with one undeniable fact. This man had been there. He had no book deal, no agent, no financial motive. He simply felt that the truth, or at least his piece of it, deserved to be heard before he was gone too. Among Elvis historians, the chef's account added a crucial layer to the existing narrative. It didn't contradict the medical evidence or dismiss the role that prescription drugs played in Elvis's decline. What it did was complicate the simple version, the version that says Elvis was a man who lost control and paid the price. Because if Elvis was genuinely thinking about change, genuinely talking about getting healthy, then his death wasn't just a tragedy of excess. It was a tragedy of timing. A man who might have turned things around if he'd had a few more weeks, a few more months, a few more honest conversations with people who actually cared about him rather than what he could do for them. The chef passed away not long after sharing his story. Like so many of the people who truly knew Elvis, not the performer, not the icon, but the man, he took most of his memories with him. Graceland still stands. The kitchen is still there, though it's been preserved behind glass now, frozen in time like everything else in that house. Tourists walk through every day, snapping photos, buying souvenirs, imagining what it must have been like. But they'll never know what it sounded like at 2 in the morning, when the house was quiet, and Elvis was just a tired man leaning against the counter, talking about starting over. They'll never know what it felt like to hand him a glass of water and watch him drink it like it was the most important thing in the world. They'll never know the weight of standing in that kitchen the next day, after the ambulance had come and gone, after the screaming had stopped, after the world found out, and realizing that the last thing you did for the king of rock and roll was something as simple and as human as making him a meal he barely touched. The chef's story didn't solve the mystery of Elvis Presley's death, but it did something arguably more important. It reminded us that behind the legend, behind the sequined jumpsuits and the sold-out arenas and the mythology that has only grown louder with time, there was a person. A real, complicated, struggling, hopping person. And maybe that's the story worth remembering. Elvis Presley has been gone for nearly 5 decades now, but the people who knew him, really knew him, are still shaping how we understand his life. Not through scandals or conspiracies, but through small, honest moments shared when the time finally felt right. If this story moved you or made you think about Elvis in a way you hadn't before, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think Elvis would have done if he'd had more time? Do you think he really could have walked away from it all? And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We tell stories like this every week, real stories about real people, told the way they deserve to be told. No hype, no clickbait, just truth. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.